I discovered that there was one that was promoting these things called, quote, I love you rituals. It says right there in their own program materials, these can be done adult to children or with children. And they had one that was like specifically like for daycares as part of a diaper changing. I was really disturbed.
Hello, moms, dads, and grands, and welcome back to M4L Academy. If you're new here, please hit like and subscribe to help out the algorithm, because this is the school for parents, grandparents, and friends who are committed to preserving liberty with a special focus on topics that impact kids, schools, and of course, parental rights. I'm Missy Karwowski, Director of Resources, and I am so glad that you have joined us for today's conversation on therapy culture's erosion of parental rights and the mental health benefits of free speech. Today's guest is Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Dr. Chloe is a clinical psychologist, USA Today best-selling author, and a bold voice for free speech and mental health freedom, with a doctorate in clinical psychology from Long Island University and a track record of helping people think clearly and speak fearlessly. Welcome back to class. And welcome to the program, Dr. Chloe Carmichael, which is the last time I'll say it now. You will only be Dr. Chloe from here on out.
Hey, Missy, it's really good to be with you.
So I am really excited to have you back. You actually spoke with Moms for Liberty previously in the past. So thank you. That was a great conversation. I'll make sure to link that in our description. You had talked then about social emotional learning, which is one of the topics that we're really diving into, or reopening, I might want to say, re-examining, take another look at. And this overstep and overreach and over therapizing in schools that is happening. So since that time, how do you feel like things are going? Do you think things are better, worse? Are your concerns growing or alleviated? How would you summarize it?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, I feel like things are getting, in a sense, worse every day within schools. However, on the positive side, I think homeschool has really taken off. More and more states are offering school choice, which is great. But I don't see schools actually ever taking any ownership and saying, maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe there's a reason why every parent who's able seems to be pulling their kid out of our schools, right? Instead, they really just seem, more accusatory towards parents than ever. So unfortunately, I don't really see a lot of self-reflection on their part.
I feel bad with or slightly bad, I guess, not that bad, but it does make me sad to think of that accusatory concept, because I think there's a bit of a us versus them that's happening on both sides. And I wish it wasn't quite that way, because it's such a different experience that I remember from when I was a kid. And I don't think that all teachers are bad, for sure. And Moms for Liberty really loves our teachers. We really do. There's so many good teachers out there, but it does feel like overall, I've even seen it in the NEA of them writing about it, of kind of like casting parents in a bad light and not trusting parents, I guess, to raise their own kids, which is kind of crazy. Which brings us into some of this. One of the things that I really want to talk about is, I guess, all of the child, right? And so one phrase we're hearing a lot about is this whole child, which is brought in through social emotional learning, or maybe social emotional learning is like the first introduction of it. What exactly is this concept of whole child? And honestly, it sounds great, right? We care about the whole person. Why shouldn't schools care about the whole child?
Yeah, I think that so I think the left has a knack for making things sound great. And there is an overlap between the left and, say, the NEA, or, schools in general. I think what are they, one of the biggest donators to the Democrat Party, in fact, is the teachers union. So I don't think we can necessarily just talk about public schools without understanding, that there is a political component to it. And so, yeah, there's this ability to make things sound good, like, oh, sure, the whole child, like, who wouldn't want to educate the whole child? But then when you unpack what they mean by that, it means typically mind, body, and spirit, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that my child, and I am a mom as well, I don't think my child's spirit is really the concern of these teachers, again, unless my child happens to be going to a Christian school. I actually even pulled my child out of, that, and we're doing homeschool now, and it's awesome. But even for me as a clinical psychologist, it's interesting to know that the root of the word psychology is psyche, which is the Greek etymology for that is spirit. And so there is something, I think, a little off-putting about the idea of, teachers who may have a completely different spiritual outlook. In fact, who look at Moms for Liberty as a hate group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who may look at, heaven forbid that you have heterosexual married parents that are white and go to church, and then they're seen as white Christian nationalists, and then there's a spiritual connotation to all of that, right? To Christianity, or to this refusal to put up, say, the 10 commandments in the schools, to act like, that's some kind of big deal. And so we can all have our disagreements on that, and that's fine. But do you want the people on the other side of that disagreement educating your child's spirit, right? And one final point, because I don't want to babble on here endlessly, but why are they taking on our child's spirit in the first place again when their test scores are plummeting, right? We homeschoolers smoke those schools in the, standardized test scores and everything all the time. So I'm like, not only does it feel weird and inappropriate, but also I don't think that they have the bandwidth to take it on either.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting to unpack what the actual meaning of it is. I hadn't actually heard of it as the concept of the spiritual aspect, which is fascinating because I feel like there's such a push, and maybe because my background, I am a Christian, and so my background is in spiritual means being a Christian, and there's just such an attack on Christianity today that it feels odd that they would try to do anything spiritual, but really it's the twisting of spirituality, it's introduction of new age spirituality, other spirituality, and like you said, they just don't have, likely do not have the same perspective that parents have, which is super important to consider. You that it's I'm just kind of curious on your perspective of this. The I think one reason why parents are also a little eager, or I don't know if eager is the right word. They find it easier to accept the concept of a whole child because my background's in the corporate world, and about 15 years ago in the corporate world, they were also introducing this concept of like being your authentic self and bringing your whole self to work. And I have some experience in HR, in operations. So then you were supposed to, look at the whole employee and all of that sort of concept. So I feel like parents were eased into it as an adult, and it made sense to a certain degree. I think there's some parts of it that do make sense as adults, and it softens or eases any concerns or warnings for a lot of people because, oh well, it's working for me, why not have it for my kids? What are your thoughts on that? Am I totally off in left field? And if there's a concern there, why would it remotely be okay for adults, but what are the issues with doing that for children?
Yeah, it's quite different for adults versus children. So, if you're in the workplace and your employer is saying, oh, well, we're going to look at the whole employee. Okay, right. So, therefore, maybe that means that, suppose that you have a disability, or, your aging mother is sick, and you want a workplace that can understand that you are more than just a productivity cog in their wheel, and that, you're an actual whole person, and that you want, your workplace to understand if you need to leave to get your kid because he's sick, or maybe you have a religious holiday or whatever. You want to be seen as a person, rather than, just a computer to do a job at the workplace. Totally fine. That makes sense. But schools, by definition, are there to teach and to educate. I would think it would be very strange if your workplace said to you, we're going to teach and educate you, about your, where you should be going spiritually, right? Again, so let's just unpack what some of that looks like behind the label, like in these schools when they talk about social emotional learning, for the whole child. So that might look like, oh, well, we're just going to talk about being inclusive, right? And so we're going to talk about the gender identity. And next thing you know, you're bringing out the genderbread, figure or whatever. Or we're just going to be talking about social justice, and next thing you know, you're having them do the white privilege walk of shame or whatever. And this is all just under the umbrella of, well, we're looking at the whole child, and the oppression that they face, and well, we're just going to do some yoga and meditation, and next thing you know, they're delving into some religious talk, or they're talking about pro-choice, or they're giving extra credit for going to a BLM rally. Or I mean, this stuff has a way of wandering way, way, way far afield from just recognizing that little Susie needs to be seen as a whole person, right? It feels like a wolf in sheep's clothing in many ways.
That's a really good point. It really is. And I've heard you talk about it before too. And for others, as we've had the conversation, I think one of the most important things for people to parents to remember is it's values that are being taught. And the definition, I think it's too easy to get caught up in this idea that, well, who doesn't want their kid to be kind or whatever? But my definition of what's kind versus Mrs. Smith's definition of what is kind is not necessarily the same. And parents really need to recognize that. It's just such a twisting of language. It's so aggravating. You had another thing that you had mentioned before that I thought was really, honestly, my jaw dropped when you talked about reviewing some SEL curriculum and seeing, or materials at least, and there were these rituals called I love you rituals that I guess the teachers were supposed to be doing with kids. First of all, why on earth would they be doing that? And can you talk about what dangers that would create?
I was reviewing for Independent Women's Forum, where I'm a fellow there, a fellow emeritus now, and they wanted me to review some of the social emotional learning materials that, just from various programs. So I reviewed them. And to my horror, I discovered, and I didn't even have to look very long or very hard. I discovered that there was one that was, promoting these things called, quote, I love you rituals. And it says right there in their own program materials, that these can be done adult to children or with children. And they had one that was like specifically like for daycares as part of a diaper changing thing about. And I was really disturbed because love is a very deep word, obviously, right? And I think that when you formalize and manualize, the quote, I love you rituals, again, we're getting into what feels like religious language, or just a ritual, right? Like that implies, really truly kind of a deeper spiritual value, and then imbuing that with a sense of love. Because with little children, when you tell them that you love them, you're communicating that you have a sense of what's best for them, and that you're going to guide them and you're going to take care of them. And that is actually the opposite, of really what would truly be the loving thing to do, right? A truly loving teacher would certainly want to keep the kids safe and teach them the materials and the objectives that he or she is tasked with doing. But the last thing they would want to do is confuse the child about what this trust bond means, or interfere with parental love, which is really the primary love for children. So yeah, I mean, the I love you rituals, and the social emotional learning material is really rife with these types of interventions that I think get into places that adults and children who are not related or part of a non-commercial relationship, because really a daycare or a teacher relationship, that's a commercial relationship at the end of the day. And let's be honest, how many parents even really know what is truly going on, with their teachers? It would be inappropriate, right, for parents even to come in and say to the teacher at teacher conferences, like, so what are your religious beliefs? And what are your beliefs about abortion? And all these things, like they would say, well, hey, that's my personal life, that's not appropriate for me to go into with you. It's like, well, okay, then why is it appropriate for you to get so incredibly deeply personal with my child if we're not I think you see what I mean.
Mhm.
The social emotional learning stuff really does feel like kind of a Trojan horse, I think, on many levels.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's important to have those boundaries up. I've heard it said, I feel like pretty much all of us felt this way, but it could have been just me. But when I would see my teachers outside of school in the real world, it was like, oh my God, you leave the school building? Like, why are you here? You like there as a child, for me, it was almost like my teacher only existed in the classroom. That was it. Like, didn't have a life, I'm sure they were a real human, obviously, but it just never even occurred to me. And I think it's so incredible that we have crossed these boundaries now in relationships. And I think we're seeing all sorts of other problems in schools because of it as well. But one of the problems I think that I definitely, well, one of the biggest criticisms I've heard anytime there's a complaint or a concern, maybe would be the better thing to say, about trying to teach these these things at home or at school versus at home. There's this pushback that, well, parents aren't teaching them at home, so schools need to teach them. What can we say to respond to that? Because that
Yeah.
feels like it shuts you down.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say, who are you to tell me what we are teaching at home? Or, how do you know what we're teaching at home? Or, maybe the teacher or the school or whomever, the teachers union, whoever the body is in that conversation, maybe they don't see you going to Wednesday night social fellowship time and Sunday school time as teaching values. In fact, there's a good chance that they think that there's something sinister or, racist or backwards or, gender confining about that, right? First of all, I would ask, how do you even know what we're teaching at home in the first place, or what we are or we're not teaching at home? And if you disagree with what we're teaching at home, that's all the more reason I don't want you stepping in, right, to try to override, whatever we may be teaching at home in the first place. Now, just to be, generous here to a certain degree, if the argument is, these children are not behaving at school, and so therefore, we're concerned that they're not learning discipline at home, I'm 100% on board with that conversation. I do think that teachers have really been cut off at the knees when it comes to discipline. I think this, whole no child left behind thing has been really hard, where we have kids graduating up to class levels that they're truly not prepared for, and they don't have any sense of personal accountability, that if they don't apply themselves, that they could be held back. We have a lot of issues with discipline, and I would like to see more discipline introduced into schools. But I don't think that the answer is, to start telling kids, that they need to, quote, be kind by using somebody's, quote, pronouns. To be generous, I can understand if teachers are saying that they feel that the students are not respecting any sense of discipline in the classroom, and that maybe teachers do correctly locate that that is a gap that needs to be filled. But I also feel like teachers have been cut off at the knees when it comes to discipline. Um, and so this, the lack of discipline, it's not a hole that's going to be plugged by teaching, people to, about the genderbread man, or, having them do the white privilege walk of shame. So, but as far as values, missing values, one value that actually would make sense to talk about when it does come to classrooms, is self-discipline and respect for authority. But yet that's not what any of this SEL seems to focus on.
So if I thought I wanted to ask you about that specifically because I don't feel like social emotional training, education, any of it does talk about that really, which is ironic. It's this idea of it is mentioned in the competencies, right? Or something like it, the self-awareness, self-awareness, self-management, is it? So technically that should be a thing. And yet we get to this discipline issue in schools, which is absolutely out of control. Why is that? Why are schools not what is it just because they're just blowing smoke up wherever for us?
Yeah, well, another issue that I had mentioned was, for example, the fact of the no child left behind. So, children don't have a sense of accountability about, hey, if I don't, learn this material, and which I would need to pay attention in class and whatnot, that I may not be, moved up to the next grade, that they don't have that sense of accountability. And as well, teachers don't have any teeth to their demands for basic respect in the classroom, because when they want to suspend a student or whatever the case may be, I think they're often met with a great deal of pushback. Oftentimes, hearkening back to this, quote, self-awareness and inclusivity, that's often pushed within this SEL, that, well, the student has their truth or whatever, and, that they felt wronged. And so that's why the student needed to, disrupt the whole classroom, or stand up and walk out of the classroom because they disagreed with the messaging of that teacher's lecture that day, or whatever the case may be.
Oh my goodness. I really appreciate you articulating it that way because sometimes it really truly is connecting the dots of all of these things that sometimes just feel a little disconnected, but just like all these crazy things going on. So I appreciate you pulling all those pieces together. I want to move on to the very connected, staying in the mental health lane, and talking a little bit about mental health screenings and the idea of interventions, because that's another area, of course, where the school would be stepping in that a parent, and sometimes without even telling the parent. Um, I I really feel like we're just seeing this massive rise in the need to diagnose and label all of everything. Everything has to have a label nowadays. And I've heard you talk about it elsewhere that it relieves our nervous system, I think you've said, or it puts some comfort there. But I think there's also some, I've heard spoken elsewhere that there's some negative sides to it that you either can, it can help explain things, or we have all seen it where it then becomes like a crutch or a reason that holds you back. And I guess I'm just curious of your perspective with your experience in particular, how do you feel like we're making too much of just normal childhood experiences and conflating them with something that has to be labeled like an actual disorder?
Yes, I think we're, medicalizing and monetizing much of just, the regular human condition. And that has really, really disastrous effects for children. Because, for example, one of the big diagnoses these days, of course, is say oppositional defiant disorder, right? Like as it what that means is a child that, you tell them the color of the day is white, they'll wear black, right? So, whatever is the direction, they will be oppositional and defiant, right? So to say that this is a quote disorder, it absolves, in a sense, the child of a certain amount of responsibility for their own behavior, right? Just
Mm.
like we would never fault a diabetic child, for needing insulin or something like that. So when we say, oh, well, this child has a disorder, they have oppositional defiant disorder, as if this is, some kind of a condition that's in any way at all beyond their control. We're undermining the child's own sense of ownership, which actually sets people up for depression, because helplessness is one of the key features of depression. When we feel helpless to, take control of our life and feel like our own actions are going to control our outcomes, that's when we do feel prone to depression. And of course, the healthy function of anxiety is to stimulate preparation behaviors. So if you have, a child who's acting out in an oppositional and defiant way, and you say, well, this, you just have oppositional defiant disorder, and the best we can do is hope to manage that, so we're going to teach you some techniques for your disorder. That's a very different way of approaching it, right, than saying, you are making really foolish choices, and it's not going to work out well for you in life unless you learn to start making very different choices than you are right now, right? Like that,
Yeah,
what one might sound harsher, right? Going back to our conversation earlier about what's kinder quote to
yeah.
say to the child, but I would say that actually giving the child some real talk is really truly the kindest thing. And then there's the role of the parents. So when the parents are told, well, my child has oppositional defiant disorder, and so I just need to take them to the therapist, and I need to give them some medication, and I need to make sure the school knows so that my child can be given a special aid and special accommodations for their ODD, their oppositional defiant disorder, right? It's a very different situation. And on a certain level, it can make the parent feel absolved of
Mm.
responsibility, to maybe start making some changes at home, take away the kids' devices, introduce some different types of disciplinary techniques. And then, of course, there's the monetizing factor. So all along, you have a therapist that's making money off of those quote therapy sessions. I say quote because I have some real questions about if there's even truly a clinical disorder in the first place.
Mm.
You have a psychiatrist that's prescribing some medication that in many cases is really doing nothing but dulling the child's senses. You have a monetization then, because then there's a teacher's aid, a special aid for this quote, disabled or disordered student to follow them around. So unfortunately, there's a big medicalization and monetization out of all of these disorders that we're labeling children with these days.
I think that is so important for people to hear and to recognize. And what you said there too about absolving parents or taking that responsibility away. It's interesting because I didn't think about this before when we were talking before we started, but it sort of almost feels like it's the same kind of thing of removing the hope that a parent has to help this get fixed. So on the one hand, okay, well, it's not really my responsibility because there's actually this disorder, so I can't be blamed for not, I don't know, quote unquote, being a good parent because I didn't want to discipline them. But it's also, I could see on another side too, sadly, the idea that they just feel hopeless, that there's no chance to fix this because there's this disorder, and I will, all of these things that I would consider normal responses, or normal ways to, like just buck up, or, whatever you want to say, that it's not going to work anyway because they have this disorder, which is like such a double-edged sword. That's for both the kids and the parents then. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So that, all that said, I think we all recognize there are certainly times that there are real mental health challenges and struggles. So just a quick second, how would you help suggest for parents who are looking for help, a good therapist? What are some tips or some things to consider uh, to help get their child the help that they may need?
Mm. Well, I would look at a place. There's a place in New York. It's called Open Therapy Institute,
Mm.
and I don't think that they even actually do therapy there. I think it's more of like a membership training hub for therapists. So there would be therapists from all over the nation, that are registered there. I've taught some courses there on things like the mental health benefits of free speech, for example. So if you have a child and you are seeking therapy for your child, I would first of all want to make sure that you're taking your child to a therapist that is just, simple shorthand here, that is not woke, right? And my own field, I say this as a clinical psychologist, we are like 95% left identifying when it comes to the political spectrum. And that's a whole other conversation, but it's part of the reason why therapy and psychology programs have gone so far off the deep end, because there's no healthy back and forth between ideologies. And when you're looking at such a soft science as psychology, you need to have a debate and back and forth within that. So the first thing I would want to do, if you must take your child to a therapist, which again, I would really encourage parents to think twice about that, if truly therapy is really, what's necessarily needed. But if you must take your child to a therapist, I would look at uh, ways to make sure that the therapist is not woke. I would want to make sure that you are able to have very deep visibility into what exactly is going on in those quote therapy sessions. I've seen many cases where young people are taken to a therapist because of the young person's, depression or anxiety or whatever. And then all that really happens in those sessions is the therapist essentially undermines the child's respect for their parents, and essentially validates all of the negative emotion that the child is having, and maybe starts making official clinical recommendations to the parents or the school about accommodations that this child should be getting, which in many cases really just enfeeble the child and teach the child to essentially weaponize what psychologists call the secondary gains of victimhood, which is kind of a
Mm.
self-explanatory term, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a parent and you're taking your child to a therapist, I would say, I how much of an open line of communication therapist are we going to have? And if the therapist says, well, I think it's probably best for the child to have a safe space, and so we'll have an agreement that I won't share anything with you unless it comes down to a true 100%, safety issue of the child, I would really think twice as a parent about if that's truly going to be the best thing, for the child.
I completely agree with you. It is sad to me that the industry seems to be so captured, although it feels like so many of our institutions are. This touches on something, excuse me, that I've heard you talk about before. You've phrased it in a slightly different way than I had heard, which is this idea of the savior complexes that adults working in mental health with children in particular, or educators, counselors, etc., might they have this savior complex concept, which overlaps, I think, with other things that I've heard of before, of teachers now being trained to be what is it agents of change in education, which is just the strangest thing to me ever, and so completely opposite of, again, what I had growing up. How can parents inoculate their children, maybe, or protect them, or what should they maybe be aware of or on the lookout for? Because that seems pretty dangerous when when the school and other institutions start believing that they know what is better and they're going to save these children from the parents.
Yeah, I mean, how to inoculate your children against it is certainly a great question, but I would also encourage parents to try to vet the adults that are going to be around their children as much as possible. And, again, if at all possible, to really consider if it's truly necessary to drop your child off for 8 hours a day, with these adults in the first place. But, when you're meeting the teacher, I would just be super transparent and see how they respond to it. You could just say, like, hey, it's really nice to meet you. I hope this doesn't sound strange, but I've heard so many things about stuff that's going on in schools these days. And I'm just curious, how do you see yourself in terms of, being an agent of change or an activist? Do you have any interest in social justice or activism? And just see how the teacher responds. If they say, "Oh my goodness, no, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. Let me put you at ease." Okay, that's a pretty good answer. But if they kind of bristle and give you some smug answer, I frankly would take that as all the information I need to know right there, right?
Hmm.
Um, and again, certainly either way, I would unfortunately, we have to talk to our children now about some of these just really ridiculous ideas, so to say to your child, look, if it ever comes up, that you're around an adult that suggests to you that, a man can become a woman, or they start using phrases to you like white privilege, or they start in any way trying to talk about the United States in a way that feels negative in an inappropriate way to you. I really want you to come talk to me. Or if they start talking to you about um, LGBTQ issues in ways that seem to contradict what you've been told at home, it's just important that we have an open line of communication, or if they start talking about the president, if they start making digs about politics, in ways that feel to you like it's outside of just reading, writing, and arithmetic, that feel like it's different from our subject matter. That's one way to inoculate them, but I don't think there's no foolproof way to do that. I think you have to just constantly be having those dinner table conversations with your kids about what exactly was discussed today, and can I see your syllabus? Can I see your textbooks? I mean, I homeschool my son, and I'm pretty careful about what textbooks he gets. But even every now and then, he'll come to me and he'll show me something in a textbook, uh, and I'm thankful that he can spot it and talk about it. But I think we can never be too careful in today's world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talk a lot here in Moms for Liberty overall. That at what point, what's the line? Where do you draw the line? When are you no longer comfortable putting this battle on your child? Because that's kind of what it's starting to feel like more and more. It's just pretty incredible. I want to shift a little bit over to one of the things that I'm hearing a lot from you now, which is you're addressing the concept of free speech in sort of a different way. Not like, I think people hear free speech and you just, oh, yay, that's my right, and I should be able to say whatever I want, and threat on free speech. And we certainly saw major threats to speech over the past 5-6 years. But you approach it from the psychological aspect, and how suppressing honest speech can actually have cause problems. So can you just unpack that, and why it is so important to be able to speak honestly?
Yes. So, my new book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, is all about the mental health benefits of free speech. And I felt the need to write it because, again, my own profession seems so concerned, and we find some of this as well in SEL materials about stamping out hate speech and insisting people use what they call inclusive language. So it's putting a lot of controls on what you may not say, and then also putting a lot of compulsory speech about what you must say to people. And again, my own profession, psychologists are obviously underwriting a lot of this material, this, social emotional learning material. And I really just felt like somebody needed, a psychologist needed, to take all of this and provide a totally different perspective, which, to be honest, it's all very obvious when you look at the book. It's obvious stuff, which is that we know that repression and suppression and denial are not good for us, right? So why would we try to stop people, from expressing their own legitimate viewpoint, right? It causes emotional dysregulation when we have to say things that we know are not true, or we're not allowed to say what we really think about something. We also have this big epidemic of loneliness. And again, of course, the social emotional learning folks are all into supposedly being kind to each other. But I believe that the quality of our social support is very seriously degraded when we're afraid to say what we really think because, we're afraid of being canceled, or we've been told, that it's hate speech to say that, you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, or that if you are, pro-life, that means, that you're a misogynist. Or I mean, there's so much stuff that is put out there um, by psychologists and by supposedly psychology backed materials um, that really stops people from using language, which is one of our most basic tools as humans, to share and exchange information, to develop good ideas and discard bad ideas, to form deep social bonds. And yet all of the output from social emotional learning and psychology fields seems so much more around governing and limiting what we can say or what we should say or what we must say than letting people have open and honest actual debates about what they really think and feel.
Mm, yeah, that is so true. It feels like there's just so much self-censorship that happens, and everywhere. I mean, and I think for a while and I do actually personally as an adult, I think there's appropriate times that you say time and place, right? Time and place. You don't always have to talk about exactly everything. And just because a thought enters your mind doesn't mean it should leave your head. So there is some common sense that I want to put as a caveat here. And please feel free to tear it down if there's something I'm not understanding, or not a different perspective I should have. But I've always thought that, like, clearly there you can't
Yes.
just say anything,
No,
right?
no. Well, thank you for that. So, a couple things that I want to share. So, in the book, there is a whole section on the difference between healthy self restraint and self censorship, right? So, if your best friend says, how do you like my new haircut, right? And it's already cut very, very short. You don't have to say like, oh well, it's makes you look such and such. You don't have to say every thought that pops into your mind. Or again, you're meeting a same-sex couple. You don't have to blurt out, well, you all don't aren't married in the same way that I see it, right?
Yep.
There's such a thing as healthy self-restraint, but self-censorship is it actually traces back to the Roman censors. The Romans had these actual censors that would ride around to the Roman territories and tell people, what values and opinions and everything else they were allowed to express. And so if you're starting to feel that pressure, like, gee, if I say what I really think here, it's like that Roman censor could, pull up on me, or I'll get kicked out of this class, or I'll be kicked out of the friend group. When we're hiding who we really are on real issues, that's when we're getting into the self-censorship category instead of just, time, place, and manner, as you said. And that's one more important, just logistical point about what free speech means. And I talk about this in the book too, is we literally have time, place, and manner restrictions built into our legal system of free speech. So as a woman, if somebody wants to go around saying women are stupid, totally fine. I don't want to take away their legal right to do that. But if they want to file for a city permit to say it on a loudspeaker outside of a Girl Scouts meeting, the city has the right to say, you have your free speech, you can say that, but not on a loudspeaker outside of the Girl Scouts meeting. So there is a time, place, and manner restriction already built into free speech in the United States.
I really appreciate that because there's this almost a weaponization of it in certain conversations that I'm hearing, where it's just taking something that is good and twisting it just a little bit and not recognizing the things that, well, we were told before, right? I forget who said it, that the America is, this government is for a good and moral people, right? A religious and moral people, and so I think that, frankly, is just our founding fathers saying, you guys got to have common sense, and if you don't have common sense, then nothing's going to work. But that common sense, of course, isn't so common anymore. So this has been absolutely wonderful. You've covered so many good things. I really appreciate what you have written. I have not read your book yet, but I am so excited to read it because I think it is one of the topics that needs to be addressed so much more today in today's world, because the threat to free speech and is just everywhere, and it's you give it more strength, I think, by explaining that it's more than just that. There's so much that goes into that. So where can people find you and follow you and your work?
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So the book, they can certainly get the book. Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly on Amazon or anywhere else. It's Audible and Kindle and paper. And I'm delighted to pop in for free to anybody's, book club or mom's group or community meeting or whatever, to give people an overview on it, so that if you want to have a way to answer back at your school board meeting or whatever, when people start talking about speech codes that they want everybody to follow, you can say, well, if we also care about mental health, which you all love to say you do, here's a few, mental health reasons why we actually should allow people to have their free speech. So and the book has techniques not only on how to speak up, but also on how to listen respectfully when other people are saying things that we disagree with, because both pieces are very important for open dialogue and to get the true mental health benefits of free speech. It's speaking and it's listening. So people can come to freespeechtoday.com. It'll go to a special place on my website, and they can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And like I said, I don't be shy if people want me to pop in virtually. I really get passionate and excited to talk about this.
Absolutely. And I want to highlight real quick, I'm definitely going to try to follow up with you. I want to talk more about speech and language and the power of language. And now there's more to it because you mentioned listening. Do you mind if I ask you one more quick question?
Sure.
Okay, so I'd heard you talk about this elsewhere, the idea of reflective listening, which I've always heard of active listening, but I'd never heard of reflective listening. Can you clarify if those two are different? And you just
Yeah.
mentioned the mental health benefits to that part. So how does that all connect?
Yeah. So active listening is different from reflective. Active listening is, where you're saying, yeah, and maybe, asking questions and things like that. You're not just kind of sitting there like a lump while somebody is speaking. Reflective listening is actually a technique from couples therapy. And when, person A says their piece, person B just simply reflects it back. They say, okay, so if I heard you correctly, you believe A, B, and C because of X, Y, and Z. Did I get that right? And then person A either confirms or they clarify until person B can accurately reflect. And then you switch chairs and, person B gets to be heard and reflected. And this is so helpful because when our heart rate goes above 100 beats per minute, we are literally not taking in and processing clearly on a cognitive level. This is why we have to practice fire drills to exit buildings, because we just get such in a tizzy that we can't even exit a building, right? So reflective listening makes sure that we're not talking past each other. It stops me from thinking about what I'm going to say next when you're talking, because I know that when you're done talking, what's going to happen next is that I'm going to reflect back what you said, right? So it helps people to make sure that they're really hearing each other and conveying a basic level of respect. And in couples therapy, this has been shown to help couples resolve arguments so much better, because they're actually really hearing each other and being respectful to each other, instead of, just waiting for their point to jump in and then getting angry that somebody interrupted them. And, so that little bit of structure really helps.
That makes sense, absolutely, and I can see using that. I could just visualize two people not married, but in advocacy, for example, or just in general talking about any of these hot button issues, and taking a minute, gosh, having a thinking of what that conversation would look like, of reflecting, reflective listening with someone as you're trying to talk through two different perspectives. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. It has been absolutely wonderful to have you on, and we will absolutely be having you back.
Thank you so much, Missy. Love to connect with you anytime. Take care.
Well, this has been a truly insightful conversation. I don't know about you, but I remember the feeling that we were living in the fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes for a few years back there. Now, I can't say that I was ever too concerned with not calling out the lack of common sense, because Lord knows I have been called a little opinionated and not conflict averse. I don't think we need to have doctors and studies and white papers telling us much of this. It really is common sense, but it does give a little more weight to your argument. So, parents, be on guard for the values redefinition that is dressed up as social emotional learning in schools. Talk with your children and take the time to vet the adults in their life. Yes, that includes getting to know the teachers in their school too. Next time you or your child faces censorship or compelled speech, remember this: free speech, or honest speech, is important and needed to support mental health. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with another friend, a parent, or a grandparent, because this message needs to be told. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to help us educate more parents on our quest to build engaged citizens, not enraged activists. Because as James Madison has always said, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. And that is the mission of M4L Academy. Class dismissed.